We are live. So welcome to Data is a Team Sport. This is School of Data's series of online conversations, videos, and podcasts where we are exploring the ever-evolving data literacy ecosystem. For those of you joining us in the Hangout, firstly, we want to say thank you so much for coming. Thank you again, Rob, for being there. Here's some guidelines that will help you in participating. First of all, we do need to ask that you stay on mute. And apologies for this. We'd love to hear everyone's voice in the conversation, but this is still a less than perfect platform for doing so. And so to prevent the painful testing of mics or being in noisy or low bandwidth environments, we'd like to invite you to participate by using the text-based chat room for communication. Rob, you know all this, so I'm not going to go into it. But just a reminder that if you do have questions during the Hangout, please type it in the text message box, and we are going to pause a bit later and answer them. As well, feel free to share any comments you have during the conversation there as well. A reminder, this Hangout is being broadcast live right now on YouTube. A recording will also be made available on YouTube immediately after we are finished. And just to note that we do have definitely one viewer already. And if you guys will notice in the lower right-hand corner, you should see something that will tell you how many viewers are watching. We are using the audio for our podcast series, and we will also be publishing notes and URLs for everything that gets referenced on the School of Data blog at schoolofdata.org. Let me introduce myself. I am Dirk Slater from FabWriters, and along with being an active member of the School of Data community, we also provide workshops, skills building, and consultation for advocates and activists on how to build inclusive data-driven tactics to make social change strategies more effective. In this episode of Data is a Team Sport, we are talking about government's role in the data literacy ecosystem, and in particular, the challenges and incentives they face in releasing data and making it available for public use. I have two experienced open data practitioners with me today, and they are Ania Calderon, Executive Director at the Open Data Charter, a collaboration between governments and organizations working to open up data based on a shared set of principles. For the past 3 years, she has led the national open data policy in Mexico and established capacity building programs across more than 200 public institutions. Welcome, Ania. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Dirk.
And I'm super happy you are here. Also joining us is Tamara Puhovski. Tamara, did I say that right?
You said it perfectly.
Great. Tamara Puhovski, she is a sociologist, innovator, public policy junkie, and an open government consultant based in Croatia who describes herself as a time traveler journeying to 19th and 20th century public policy centers and trying to bring them back into the 21st century. So welcome to you, Tamara.
Thank you for having me. A time traveler present here and now.
I'm glad you made it. I'm glad you got the time.
That wasn't easy.
Time machine to work. So a question to start us off, and I think I'll start with Ania on this. Wondering, Ania, where do you see the biggest challenges in getting governments to open data?
Sure, Dirk. Well, I think in my experience, working to open data inside of government means trying to provide change within government, and that is always a daunting task in itself. We know that open data is more about than just putting out data sets. It requires changing established norms. It requires changing mindsets, but also leveraging partnerships and then being able to build the skills and the trust that is needed to process that data and ultimately start to see some improvements in governance or other areas of impact. And that, of course, is a much longer and more complex process. It requires overhauling systems that were designed to be closed in the first place to actually make them open by default instead. And this is one of the core principles that the Open Data Charter advocates around. So for me, the biggest challenge in getting government to become open by default is changing what is often a risk-averse culture into one that values openness as a means to improve their outcomes and be able to deliver for citizens. So it's not just about transparency and accountability. I think perhaps an example here where this became clear to me while I was working in the government of Mexico is how I saw how hard it was for government officials to be able to access the information that they need to design and deliver the policies that they are tasked to deliver, and then make better decisions every day. And these are decisions that are affecting the lives of millions. This was a challenge to access data within their own ministries, and even harder when we start trying to access data that is outside other ministries. But then when information was available, an even bigger gap was having the skills required inside of government to process that data. That it's a huge gap that is often lacking. And for example, in Mexico, there was a nationwide industrial policy that was being developed to democratize productivity. But information that the finance ministry needed around this about what skills were available in our country and where was at best 5 years old and available at very aggregate levels. This is too late and not detailed enough to be able to inform what type of labor investment is needed in each region to be able to thrive under. But then we realized that turning to the health ministry, the social security data, with that, we could track the type of skills that part of the working population has at a very granular levels, and how then labor migrates across sectors and even across within cities in almost real time. But here, sharing one agency's data with another, especially one that involves personal data, takes a long legal and very bureaucratic process. So the case for opening that data was strong, being able to open that data, making sure it was anonymized and ready to use, actually helped break those silos inside of government. But then it also allowed for others, those that did have the skills, were data literate, as well as domain experts, to be able to collaborate with academic institutions as part of what became an Atlas for Economic Prosperity project that it's now powered by open data from several government agencies, including data from the dynamics of employment, from salaries, trade flows, other characteristics to be able to understand what are the economies that could potentially emerge in the country in the near future. So on top of having government use its own data to improve their policies, having a data literate citizenry on top of that would mean being able to have an army of outsiders to make sure that the way government is using its data is then translated into doing the right thing, but also a broad sector of society who is also extracting value from this data. Whether it's companies that deciding where to open their offices, students choosing what types of professions might offer them better salaries, and ultimately working together to enhance the goal that this productivity program was after. So opening data is about achieving better results.
One of the things I love about that example that you just gave is it exemplifies very much what we are trying to get across in this series, which is about the data literacy ecosystem. Like there are so many different factors that are needed in order for data to get used, and one of the things that you've just pointed out is that like even within a government, there's all sorts of government departments, right? Like one piece of data needs a whole bunch of input and use by other government agencies and all that for it even to make sense. And then you have the whole thing of like, how are citizens picking it up and using it? So Tamara, let me bring you in and get you to talk a little bit about your own experiences and what your lessons learned are in getting governments to open up data and be data literate.
Well, I think I can say I agree with everything that's been said and make it much easier for everybody. But maybe it'd be useful to kind of talk about it has changed a lot. I mean, if you asked me this question a year or 2 years ago, I would have answered differently. So maybe it'd be useful to talk about, what are some of the new things that I've been seeing and trying to tackle. But before I do that, I should say that I used to work in the government for 4 years, so that people have the understanding of where I'm coming from in order to be able to critically evaluate what I'm saying. And also that I work in a region of Western Balkans mostly. So what has been happening is that I see there are three kind of problems going on. One is that motivating governments to open data. That's one. Second is, okay, we opened up data, but nothing happened, which is then a problem with demand in the ecosystem outside of the government. And then the third one is not being specific about what kind of data and not looking at data beyond technology. So what I mean by that is, for example, in India, they took the data from, they were fighting fiscal transparency, and took data about the money spent, and they wrote it on the walls. So data is not necessarily about technology, and we sometimes forget that. In this kind of environment that I work in, I've come up with an equation, if you'd like to know, of how to get it done.
Oh.
To get things mathematical. It's kind of a joke, but I say it's political capital plus the amount of different sectors you have in the CVs of the people who are implementers, times the enthusiasm and the effort you're willing to invest in the project. That's, the kind of stuff that's needed for things to work out. And, I'm very careful to kind of give tips to government whisperers, because I think it really depends on even the person that you're working with. But what concerns me the most is the connection between open data and capitalism, if you will, or the market. And then again, to provide some context, I was born and raised in socialism, so I do have a different kind of a perspective on public good and private sector. And I do think that open data, the way that we are advocating for open data is generally, you quote the European Commission findings on how many millions of euros open data will bring. And the problem with that is that you can only use it once. So you go to the governments and you say, this is going to make a lot of money for the budget, for the citizens, they'll be happy. And then when that doesn't happen, it usually doesn't happen, at least not straight away. And they all have only 4 years or less than 4 years to prove that what they're doing is useful. You can't use it again. Secondly, this argument that connects data to money is a problem, because we are kind of teaching our governments that, they're not doing it because it's their job to do it. They're doing it because we can provide evidence of, benefits. And it's advocating governments is becoming more and more about providing benefits for them, whereas it should be, do your job kind of a thing. So sooner or later, first of all, they're going to ask, show me the money. And second of all, they're going to get used to looking at their job as, okay, I'll do it if you provide me a clear analysis of what kind of benefits that is for me, which is of course useful, but we need to take care of doing that. And then thirdly, I think that, data is public good. So data doesn't necessarily have to make commercial sense. Of course, that's important. That's one a part of it. And I think that, private sector, and I'm in the private sector now as I have my own company, is very important. But I think that there are a lot of different priorities for opening up data. And if you miss in the beginning in advocating these priorities, then you have a problem with the process. And these priorities can be from internal priorities for the government. So what kind of data do you need to make the administrative process better, to what kind of multilateral agreements you have, to what kind of sexy data for the citizens, and priorities that should be looked at for having data published. So for me at the moment, and this is such a huge discussion that I chose just this little micro perspective, for me at the moment, it's really about looking at opening data and trying not to advocate it as a clear kind of financial gain. And secondly, as I'm an open government expert, first of all, for me, it's also about, making sure that open government is not being whitewashed by open data. What I mean by that is that very often open data is kind of the easiest and the least politically sensitive thing to do in open government. So open data is going to get much more funds and kind of energy put into it, because then the governments say they are open when they really are not that open, but they're not doing the other stuff. So I think it really have to bring it down to very simple definitions. And the one that I use is that you have an open government, and the way that you can evaluate if you have an open government is to say how likely and easy it is for citizens to interact with government. That's the goal. And
Yeah,
should be that.
Well, and one thing that you've just highlighted as well that I think is really critical is that government and the government is not capitalism. Like, or governments shouldn't be having this like we need to make money as its ultimate goal. And I think that's one of the things that people often do put a thing on, oh, government should be run by business, or government should be run like a business, and they are not a business. Government's reason for being is about public good and all that sort of stuff. But it's something that often gets.
I think it kind of went from from the people, by the people, to for the business and by the business, and it's a big danger, definitely, to all our freedoms.
Yeah, and also in that. In terms of, people that use data really well are corporations, right? And they have a lot of incentive for using big data, collecting lots of information about all of us, and then being able to translate that into increased profit margin. Where the incentives for government are very different. It is about that bit of providing the data for the public good, or at least that's what it should be. But there's an earlier bit, corporations have money, right? They've set aside money and are very good at doing the data bit because they have to. Whereas it's different for government. And one of the things I want Ania to maybe come in a little bit with is what is it in terms of how do you the capacity, right? How do you get government to actually build that capacity in the first place to actually be using data in a good way?
Well, I think the capacity issue is an essential one for any data-driven government to be able to leverage the value of opening the data it generates. And just to say that I want to agree with what Tamara is proposing, that open data in itself is a good thing, and is something, it's not a nice to have, but a must have that governments need to start looking into. But I think just positioning or trying to sell it as something that is required could also lead to sort of not being able to target or prioritize what type of data sets governments are starting to open, so that we actually see its use leading to impact. And that's where I think building capacity and use of the data that government generates for the programs that they're looking to achieve is so important, because the goal we should be advocating around is for the way government implements and designs its policies to be able to improve the lives of citizens. We don't just want data for its own sake. So in a way, being able to prioritize data literacy inside of government needs to be integrated as an essential part of the policy-making cycle around how they're designing and delivering the programs that they're looking to achieve. And I think this, on one hand, my experience has been that largely that's not the case. It's more so you see governments making decisions based on intuition rather than really leveraging data in sort of real time or optimum values in terms of making decisions, and then being able as well to adjust. So on one hand, I perhaps would drill it down to different layers. It is a positive aspect to have in itself, such as transparency and accountability. We should not take that for granted. We should make sure it's connected with how it's leading to better outcomes, and that requires the use and data literacy inside of government. But it also is in the interest of governments to prioritize data literacy in its citizens, because often the skills are not within government, but it also will help or allow for building of coalitions in support of a type of collective delivery around their goals, while providing an additional layer of accountability to make sure that the way programs are being implemented are actually leading to impact, and if not, be able to course correct before it's too late.
Interesting. So, because I have this thing in my head, like, okay, so government needs to sort of prioritize data literacy for itself, and then, you know, it needs to prioritize data literacy for its citizenry, and I think of that as sort of a two-step thing. But I think maybe what you're saying is that it is, you know, it needs to be approached as a more cohesive, you know, thing. Those two pieces are not mutually exclusive from each other.
Probably, and I would think it's part of a cycle in being able to test a few things around how programs are delivered, learning from how that's playing out in practice, and being able to adapt and empowered through data-driven learning and use of it to be able to have broad participation with citizens in forming those policies and whether they're actually meeting their needs and demands.
Tamara, how do you see this sort of bit in terms of, you know, getting governments to prioritize data literacy both within itself and you know, also with the public? Did I lose you, Tamara?
No, I'm here. I just, you froze for a second, but I wasn't sure if you were making a face or if the screen was frozen. I thought you were...
No, it's fine. So, but how do you see that bit in terms of, you know, how do you get governments to both prioritize data literacy for themselves, but then also prioritizing for the public?
Well, this is what I was going to say. I mean, I think Ania is such a good expert in explaining all this that I kind of feel coming after, I just need to add a couple of things. And in the first bit, this was adding that we need to be very careful in connecting data to technology and data to money. Secondly, when it comes to working with governments, I think that if we all sit together, we know very well what we want them to do and why. That's not the issue. The issue is how you get them to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I go back to the equation. This is definitely political capital. So you need to have a person who has strong political capital, who is willing to push for this. That's definitely one of the necessary things. And then secondly, you need to have people who can do this. And I'll give you an example of how ridiculously things can get in the way. For example, in public procurement, in Croatia, you had an example where you had agreements with private companies where you didn't specify that you want your data in machine readable formats. So what would happen was that when you ask, so you want to publish data and you ask the companies to provide the data that they are storing or whatever for you, and then they charge you extra money if they deliver it in a format that's not PDF. So it goes back to educating civil servants about, you know, what kind of formats they need to have and need to ask for, making internal documents about public procurement, about, you know, what needs to be in those agreements, changing all those agreements. So it really is kind of down to knowing, scanning what's going on in the government and then finding way around changing that. And I think that when I work with civil servants, I think that it really does help the fact that I used to work in the government, because very often people who work with them come from the outside, so they don't come from the government sector. They're usually very tech savvy, which I'm not. So I'm embarrassingly technologically uneducated and have no technological literacy, which actually helps because I simply speak in a very simple language. And then thirdly, it's, for example, there is, I don't know if you know about it, there is a Google document about, you know, all the excuses about opening up data. I don't know if you know this.
No, I haven't. No.
Oh my God, it's the best thing ever. Like, everybody who's working with governments, this is the first thing you need to have. So there is an online Google document, I'll send you the link, where people put in excuses why not to open data. And then they put in you know, how you get, what are the arguments against those excuses. For example, there is an argument, you know, what if terrorists, this was used in actually Zagreb public transport, we still don't have an app which tells you in real time when the, you know, buses are coming. And one of the arguments was used, you know, what if terrorists find this? And it's ridiculous in our context. So yeah, you get that document and you go through it, and you make sure that, you know, people know these are excuses, and then you can get down to real problems, such as, for example, the one with the public procurement that I told you about. But, you know, everything Ania said, absolutely, you know, raising the level of literacy when it comes to data, tech skills, and so on, all of that is a big, big job to be done within the governments. And one of the problems is that, you know, and this is why I joke that I'm a time traveler, because, you know, public administration moves so slowly that it can't work in the pace that we have now, especially technologically. It can't work that fast. And this is a huge problem, because if we don't make governments, you know, pick up speed and provide things that are manageable and interesting and usable for citizens, then the only things that politicians are left with in convincing people why they should stay in power and get money for what they do is, you know, scaring people and, you know, becoming extremists, because, you know, you can't prove otherwise that you're useful. So we have a very important job in everything that's going on in the world today, in, you know, making governments pick up pace and kind of be at the same level and the same pace as the societies are, which is extremely hard.
Yeah. Just before I move us on, I just want to see if, Ania, if you had anything else you wanted to add to that.
Well, I think, I mean, I've seen this Google Doc and I think it's a great resource, but I'd like to see us move beyond sort of explaining why we need to open data and show cases and stories of use of why it's providing a value, and why by opening data, public officials are going to be able to develop better health programs or education outcomes in the education ministry. It's actually going to help them achieve their goals. It's in their interest, and that requires linking data from the start to what are the problems and solutions that we're trying to build together.
Well, and so,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Tamara. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I only partially agree, or rather, I would make sure to say that what Ania's talking about is the level of advocacy that you have to have with officials, not with civil servants. So these are, you know, politically elected people that are on a high level where they can make decisions, because this doesn't work with civil servants. Civil servants do what it says on a piece of paper is their daily job and their responsibility, and that changes very slowly, or what they're told by their superiors. It's a very non-dynamic hierarchical system. So even as citizens, if they understand, of course, that, you know, connecting data to and understand why this will be beneficial, that does not necessarily mean that as civil servants they can and will do it. So that's one thing. And then secondly, the thing with officials, so people, for example, ministers and so on, you can't, you know, you can't create an app if you don't know what a cell phone is. So the problem is that you need to advocate that way before they are in the office. Once they're in the office, it's too late. If they don't already know about data and open data, it's very hard to find room and time to start explaining, you know, the benefits and connect. It's very hard. So I think, for example, for me, I've been trying to work on a project to do this kind of education and awareness in political parties, and trying to make it a system to kind of go up in your political party by doing something that's new and useful, because I think we are doing it way too late.
Yeah. Well, and so just to point out, because I think you guys have started to flesh out a little bit in terms of what this ecosystem for governments opening up data looks like. So we've got elected officials, we've got civil servants, we've got citizens, and then also there's advocates. And and these folks are all trying to work together to get governments to doing the open data. And this bit that also Ania, brought up in terms of like, making that argument and showing how this all works together and is a benefit to sort of everybody in the ecosystem. Curious for both of you, like, where do you see gaps within that ecosystem? Like, what's what does there need to be more of? And Ania, you mentioned that bit in terms of having those good stories. And Tamara, you've been saying, well, it's also this bit of like getting people to do that understanding of the tech and all that, and what it all means well ahead of time. Just curious if there's anything else for both of you in terms of the gaps.
Sure, maybe I can jump in, and I really liked the fact that Tamara raised these two different levels of what I like to call in terms of being able to think politically but work technocratically, and those require very different strategies and how we approach each of these. So I definitely agree with that, and I think one of the major gaps in providing is more around that sort of technocratical level, providing support for public officials that are tasked to implement open data policies and what types of resources are available, or even a lack of a safe space, I would argue, to be able to share challenges and opportunities around opening data within their government. And on one hand, having the political and high-level support in that political capital is important, but then we need to focus the strategy on delivery, and that really is sort of where the devil is in the details. And perhaps around how delivery happens, I think in regards to the data literacy ecosystem, we're not placing enough emphasis to precisely what we're beginning to discuss now, which is the systems part of it. Usually when people seek to use data, it's about developing an understanding of a new idea or a tool or a story that can act as a tool to help achieve some sort of impact in the world. But that initial expectations, that placing data in the hands of people and then providing all sorts of incentives that we've seen happen for them to start to use it to somehow bring the changes we wish to see has been incredibly, well, I would say overly optimistic. For data to lead to impact, which is what we want to see happen in the data literacy sphere, is really much more complex. And to understand what is needed to close that impact gap, we recently published a paper with Transparency and Accountability Initiative on rethinking data for accountability. And in this framework, we outline a few of the key conditions that we think are needed across a data to accountability cycle. And basically that starts with the data, how data is produced, how it is shared, the skills available that is needed to be able to process it, and then an enabling environment for the insights that are derived from its use to lead to action, and essentially having a response mechanism in place to actually make a difference. So I see that it's good that there is now a greater push from organizations and donors for greater data use. Often that includes data literacy programs, but some of the conversations that we are having around increasing data use only risk reinforcing what I think is an unhelpful dichotomy between supply and demand, or supply use, and it risks paying insufficient attention to a wider value chain or system that determines whether and how data leads to impact.
Right, and I think there's a piece in order for that to happen. One of the things that within my own work within the transparency and accountability sphere, I've noticed that there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of people that are really good at getting governments to open up data and make it useful are really good at communicating with government. And that sort of policy and wonkishness and all that. Not necessarily the best kinds of folks that are able to engage citizens and understand what how this benefits citizens and what citizens would want to be using in the data, like how is the data important for them? How are they actually going to use it and make it a difference in their day-to-day lives? And I always feel like there's a piece there for advocates, right? Like the sort of missing piece in that is like there has to be a good coalition or broad working group in terms of transparency and accountability, open data advocates, and then advocates that are just working within trying to improve citizens' lives, and getting them to have that back and forth in terms of here's how the data is actually useful to real people and getting it out there. But Tamara, I want to get you to sort of come in and tell me a little bit in terms of where do you see gaps in the work that you're doing?
I think I'd have to ask you to kind of specify what you mean by gaps in the work I'm doing, because I think this is a very broad discussion, and it is very and it's very specific in different countries and different cultural cycles and so on. I think that we have to be aware that what we are discussing in England or in UK or in Mexico or in US, it's a very different thing than what we are discussing in Croatia or in Kosovo, where I'll be working next. So, I think.
Well, let me just say apologies. I was speaking more generally. So apologies for getting off.
I mean, maybe we should ask listeners what they would find useful and where they're coming from. I don't know if you've had any questions thus far.
We haven't had any questions thus far, but Tamara, what I wanted you to speak to was your own context in terms of Croatia, in terms of where you're working, because I think that is really critical for us to get out. Apologies.
I think that what I find, amusing in a very tragic way is that at the last Open Government Partnership Summit, I kind of was perceived and named as an expert in difficult contexts, which, fair enough. It's not easy to work in these countries. But then, with things happening with Brexit and with Trump elections, I kind of thought, well, now my expertise in difficult contexts is becoming of global importance. So, there are things that, and I've heard the term, for example, enabling environment be mentioned, I think like maybe 10 or 20 times in the last month. So I think that the kind of in where I am at, and when I started working on all this, I think kind of the first generation of people fighting for this is now kind of passing on the torch to the second generation. And I think it's very important that we think our fight was getting open data and data to become mainstream. That was our fight, to make people and governments and citizens and everybody understand, and it was a very small group of people, and it was usually tech people who were fighting for this. Now I think, and it happens with everything from feminism to open data, when you pray for something to become mainstream and then it becomes mainstream, and then you're not that glad it has become mainstream, because you have a lot of misunderstanding and you have a lot of second generation problems. For example, personal security. And, at the beginning, we were like, open everything up. The most important thing is to send a message to open things up. Now we're talking about, things that shouldn't be open and what we should keep closed, and what if there's too much data. So I think, and this connects to your question about post-truth world, I think that it's really not about data. I think for this generation of, both activists and users, it's going to be about, values and what you do with data and how you connect data, definitely. And this is something that's barely starting in the region where I'm working, whereas in your regions, as far as I understand, this is well underway. So I think that the biggest gaps that I see when it comes to data in the region is still kind of the first generation problems, where we are still talking about opening up enough data sets and having enough people use them. And we do speak in supply and demand, which might be oversimplification, but I think in this context, it's not just right kind of simplification to get things started. And luckily, and this is the great thing about being on periphery, is that you can maybe skip a few steps. And what I would definitely like to skip is creating very knowledgeable and specific communities around data that are unpenetratable and that are the only ones who can push for data. So I would rather have a much broader group of stakeholders who are, whatever, advocating agricultural change, use data, than have a group of people who are advocating data talk about agriculture.
True. Since you raised it, and actually want to connect our last podcast, which was Mentors, Mediators, and Mad Skills, featured your colleague Tin Geber, who is also based in Croatia.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things around this question of how has your practice changed in the wake of post-fact fake news and all that, one thing he pointed out was that you guys have been in the sort of post-fact mode for quite some time, and it's not really something new.
Yeah, I think that, when you come from these kind of countries where we've had, quite a big change. We were joking the other day, we lived in pre-truth era, and now we live in post-truth era, and we're never gonna live in the truth era. So yeah, I think that actually puts us in an advantage in dealing with this.
Yeah. One thing I just want to point out, Rob, if you do have any questions, we would love to answer them. Please feel free to type that into the chat box. But Ania, for you, in terms of this frame and within the context of Mexico, how have you seen things change, or have things changed in terms of the post-fact, fake news, data-driven confusion themes that have been going on in other parts of the world, or in your part of the world? Oh, you're on mute. Come off mute. There you go.
Great. So for us, that's actually quite a funny story, because even though the charter has been going on for a few years, it was created as a movement that brought together governments and organizations that created a set of shared principles on how open data policies and programs should look like. But it was until recently that the charter stewards selected a small team to form its secretariat and support its network. And we actually came, our very first day as a small team of 3 was the first day that Trump came into office. So that for us was an important reflection, and it really, I think, influenced the way we started to think about the strategy of the Open Data Charter itself, where we were seeing as things were being rolled out, how fragile these programs often are, and what it takes to take open data to a point of no return. And basically that very much helped us shape our strategy into looking to support and embed openness in governments, a culture of openness and practice in governments in ways that are difficult to reverse. And so now we're working together with a group of leaders inside of government that are currently facing changes or have faced changes in administrations, to learn more about what strategies they've deployed to make open data sticky within their government. And basically we're trying to see how to take those lessons and share it with a broader sort of network of peers around the Open Data Charter, and make sure that these strategies are resilient to changes in administrations that might not support openness as much as prior governments.
Great. Also just noticing Rob has just put in a comment saying that he recently did a presentation to the Canadian federal government OpenGov team on open data versus post-fact politics and open some eyes. Rob, if you have any helpful links or stuff like that, stuff that you shared within that presentation that you put in the comments thing, I would love to include that in our in the blog post of resources that we get out there. And also just to say, Ania, that theme that you just mentioned in terms of the point of no return for open data. How do we get there? And I could see that as being like a future endeavor. Well, future for everyone. I think one of the things that is really critical in terms of this theme of open data, and one thing we haven't talked about in terms of government and all that, is timeframes, right? And one of the things that I think for transparency and accountability advocates, like an important aha and learning for them recently, and this gets into a point that you made, Tamara, in terms of like the first generation, and now we're seeing a second generation. It is going to take generations for us to get to a point where the open data is the norm, and that everyone within the ecosystem is working with it together, and we need not to lose sight of that. But I think the other piece there of what you just said, Ania, which is so critical, is this, like, it's still very much fragile phase, and it takes a long time to get to that point where it is not fragile. And we are definitely seeing a lot more of those governments that we thought were on the right track kind of sliding back. And I think that's what's been terrifying about the post-fact thing. But it is a lesson for all of us in looking at, like, how fragile it is, but how do we get to that point of no return for open data? And so,
but I think something that we've all learned is that democracy is extremely fragile and always will be. I don't think there are guarantees, and I think when it comes to governments, there is nobody more recidivist, if that's a word in English, than the governments are. And that's why when we started talking, when you asked me the first question, I started talking about things that I think are causing problems in kind of sustainability of the whole open data policies from my perspective, and in the context that I'm working at, because it is quite different. We don't have a lot in these countries that governments can go back on, so we are still kind of building up the institution, the awareness, the skills, and so on. But and this is what I also, when I said it's sometimes good to be on periphery, is that we, working on this very beginning now, also can see how quickly things can backslide, and we can try and integrate that in our beginning strategies as well, which is I think very hard. And I think that you always have these big discussions about how to ensure that democracy survives and open government survives and open data survives. And I think the only smart thing that anyone has ever been able to come up with is educated, aware, active citizens. I mean, that's at the bottom of it, and it's the only and education, that's the only thing that can ensure it. But the things that I told you about that I felt were big problems is the using money as incentive, which you can only use once, and is what they say about technologies like fire, it's a great servant but a horrible master. So making sure that it's not all about technology and technology driven, because that's not how good and sustainable open data policies are made.
Right. And also, just let me get to just real quick to that bit on you can only use the argument with governments that it's going to save you money, or the money incentive once. Can you just remind for the listeners what that was about?
So can you repeat it? I didn't hear.
Your money is you can only use money as an incentive once. That phrase.
That wasn't clear. Well, yeah, because I mean, when you look, so basically, 80% of my job comes down to government advocacy, either helping NGOs and organizations with government advocacy, or actually doing work with governments. And it is very often, because it's all data driven, you come to the governments and you're like, here's the data. It's usually from the European Commission on how much, until 2020, open data will generate in a society. And, it's a very powerful argument. But then the problem is that the government will come back, within a year or 2 years and be like, show me the money, where is that money? And unless you're very careful in how you use that argument, you can't use it again. You can't say, oh no, there's no money so far, but in the next, by 2020 or by 2050 there will be money. So it's a very fragile argument that can seriously injure the kind of authority you have. And this is really one of the most important things when you're advocating with governments. So besides the value and principle problem I have with using the financial benefits for advocating governments, there is a very practical reason to be careful when using that argument.
Great, thanks for that. That's super helpful. So we are rapidly starting to run out of time, and I want to give you both an opportunity. Maybe starting with you, Ania. Is there stuff in terms of your own work that you would like to plug that people should know about? And also, just to remind you both, if you could put after this conversation, if you could put the links into the Google Doc, the episode guide, I'd greatly appreciate it. But Ania, if you just want to, anything you want to plug in terms of the Open Charter work or anything else in terms of your own work that people should know about.
So I think what I'm left with after this conversation is how important it is to provide that ownership within the way that government goes about designing and delivering their own programs, that ingrains data and the use of data as an essential part of it. And being able to access and process data is important, but it's not the same thing as being able to produce an action and then having the conditions in place for that action to lead to a response for a specific challenge that we're facing. And that's something we're currently trying to test out with a series of open up guides that we're producing to try to bring these sort of broad open data principles into concrete actions for how sectors are achieving impact. And we're starting with one around anti-corruption that is being road tested with the government of Mexico, and looking into sort of this wider data value chain that we've been discussing. And maybe to wrap up, I've currently been going back to Duncan Green's helpful advice on how to make change happen, and he calls for activists, and I think this applies to those both inside and outside of government, to become better reflectivists. That requires taking the time to understand the system before and while engaging it. And if we do this in a way that is sort of powered through data and how we open and use that data, I think we'll have more tools to come up with change in more effective manners.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that second point, because my other question is what stuff is inspiring you and helping you in your work. So that's super helpful to get that thing in for Duncan Green. And I always look forward to his new posts when they come out. Tamara, for you, anything you want to plug in terms of your own work? What should people know about?
Well, sure, if you tell me what plug means, I'll be happy.
Oh, sorry. What should...
I'll be happy to plug if you tell me what it means.
Let people know. No, it's the thing of like, what in terms of your own work, what should people know about? Are there resources, things out there that you put out that it would be good to point people's attention to?
Well, I didn't really come prepared to pitch anything, so I don't have a pitch prepared. But no, I think that, I am writing blogs on, kind of 10 things to keep in mind checklist when advocating with governments. And I'm trying to kind of, give it a clickbait title, kind of, you won't believe what she did when she was in the government, kind of a thing, so that people would read it. So if that's helpful, that's great. But no, nothing to pitch at the moment.
Oh, okay. Well, listen, if you do think of stuff in the meantime, I'm happy to put that in the blog post this conversation. But it also in that same vein of what Ania raised with Duncan Green, is there other resources, things out there that you find inspiring?
Well, I think that and this goes back to the post-truth era that we're living in. I think that I'm trying to cut down on the information and links that are online, because I think that one of the problems that, and I'm old enough to remember time without internet, that we've had is that internet, however great it is, especially when it comes to cute cats, it really did present a huge inflation of information. So the more stuff is out there, the less value it has. And the fight now is not to kind of increase the number good stuff there. I think the fight is going to be to give weight and to ponder things and try and think of a way to do that. So I really, the inspiration that I get is from talking to people and working with people in the government and trying to understand their perspective and kind of understand their perspective as working in the government before. So I'm reducing. I'm trying to reduce the number of things I put out there and get from online resources.
Great.
I'm not sure if this is helpful. I think it's a very
yeah, you've completely destroyed
a horrible thing to say
especially because
such as this, but that's what I'm doing.
We've been making a point of collecting these and have now like a long list of links of inspirational stuff. So you've just completely torpedoed all the work that I've been doing over the past.
No, I think it's not. Oh God.
Oh, I tease it.
No, that's not what I meant to do. And I didn't mean to say there aren't useful things. There should be useful things out there. I think that connecting us, for example, having and we talked about this. For example, the problem is that we are treating people as passive users as they were once when they were reading newspapers, whereas now people are actually all people are journalists instead of all people are readers, kind of a thing. So I think that when we put things out there and when we talk about resources, we need to find a way to do it completely differently because the matrix is different. So I think, for example, I've been trying to advocate things as a social network for OGP or open government or open data, people where you can have a time bank and get half an hour of somebody you find useful rather than writing blogs and putting literature out there. So the content is important, it should be out there, it's just that the way that we do it needs to change.
And I actually want to and applaud that, because like one of the things that we've talked about in this series quite a bit is how important it is for things like mentorship and for people to be able to connect and share learnings and all that sort of stuff with each other. And I always appreciate it when I hear colleagues talk about having open office hours where anybody can come and ask them questions and things like that, because I think that's a great way for us to be building solidarities.
And if I can just jump in quickly, going back to civil servants, I have found, and this is ridiculous, but it's true, I have found that the most useful thing that I could do for them is give them my Facebook profile and then they can message me. Because, for example, the problem with civil servants when they do this kind of work is they have nobody to ask, because they can't ask their superior, because you can't ask your superior if you don't understand how you should do your job. They don't have any colleagues who work on open data because it's such a rare thing to do, and they don't have any predecessors, so they can't ask people who used to do it. And they can't ask NGOs and consultants and people outside of the government, because they're civil servants and they're representing their government, and they can't say, listen, I'm not quite sure how to do this, can you help me? So what I've told them is like, listen, this is my Facebook profile. You can message me anytime. I usually answer in a couple of hours, and it's between us. And I promise you, it's between us. And then I've been getting like messages, like, for example, this is the way I put the wording in the document. Do you think that will work, or would you change something, kind of a thing? So definitely having a time bank or open office hours, I think, would be very helpful for government people working in the government, because they don't have the same kind of ability to ask around that we do.
Great.
And just to say, that really resonates with what we've been hearing from governments adopting the Open Data Charter, and then public officials that are tasked to deliver those commitments. There's really no safe space to be able to exchange views and ideas around this. So just to say that we've recently began a very sort of light touch approach into brokering connections between different government officials that are experiencing similar challenges, also with experts or from organizations outside of government.
And you can always give them my Facebook.
I will follow up with you, definitely.
Tell them I'm a government survivor, so that if they need help, I can definitely try.
I know what that feels like.
Yeah.
That's great. I love that. So we are slightly past the hour. So I do want to wrap us up. One thing I want to remind both of you, so first of all, Ania, thanks for putting all those links in there. Two pieces that you've mentioned, and Forgive me, Tamara, for piling on the URLs, but I do want to make sure I get that link for the bit that you mentioned in terms of the Google Doc.
I'll send that. That's the very useful one thing that you have to bring with you if you're going advocating with governments. And I'll try and send the blog with how to negotiate priorities for publishing open data when negotiating with governments. So I'll send those. And
Great.
And you have to save my reputation, because now I'm kind of the Grinch that stole internet links. So
the Grinch that stole all our fabulous links and resources that we've been compiling. No, of course.
Please do something to save my reputation.
That's great.
That just sounds horrible.
Ania, on you, I want to make sure you send me if you haven't in there already, that piece you mentioned earlier on the TAI report that you guys put together. That'll be critical for folks. So please include that as well. And if you don't mind, I will now wrap us up. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Cool. So to say this concludes this online conversation for Data as a Team Sport. It's been great to do this deep dive into government's roles, incentives, and challenges around data literacy. A big thank you, Ania and Tamara. I really appreciate your time and all the wisdoms and learnings you have just shared. I have to give a big thanks to Caitlin Rogers and the School of Data team for making this all happen. Please stay tuned to the School of Data website for more information on the Data is a Team Sport series. You can find the notes from these conversations along with the links to the video recordings of the Hangouts in the blog at schoolofdata.org. Have I mentioned the podcast series? You can find it on the School of Data website, SoundCloud, the iTunes Store, and Stitcher. Just search for Data is a Team Sport. And a big thank you to Rob, our participants, and also our listeners and viewers. We hope this has benefited and informed your own data literacy efforts.